Welcome to the third and final episode of Charting Creation, where I talk about creating this work, Entropy Awakening, alongside Dr. Marie Hadley and the University of Newcastle. Once again, this work was commissioned by the University of Newcastle and Marie. In this episode, I'll be going into the process of creating the work alongside my Procreate Process video, exported from Procreate. I'll be stopping and starting the process video quite a bit and talking about in-depth bits of my process, artwork and photography around how I create digital artworks. The image you can see at the moment is the final image of Entropy Awakening, and we'll come back to that a bit later, but let's jump in. So this is the Procreate process. You can see me starting a quick sketch up of the composition. I've already done some sketches on paper that you would have seen in the previous videos, and then I decided to take a reference image. So we're going to take a quick look at some of the reference images I use and how I use them in my work. So what I'll do is take a photo on either my digital or my film camera, import it into Procreate, and then either use it as just a pure reference to draw from, or I will occasionally trace, or I will use a process called photo bashing, where we combine multiple photos together along with drawing and painting techniques to working into them to create a completely new thing, which is something that I've used a lot in Entropy Awakening, and we will talk about that when we get to it, but I just wanted to include a few examples of other works that I've created using my reference images, and I have an extensive reference image library that I draw from of images that I've collected. So as you can see here, I'm using the reference image of a drawing model and sketching in the details of the statue, or of the humanoid figure that will become a statue in the final work. And then I'm repeating, copying and pasting basically that image and playing around with the composition. And I've also brought in the reference images, which is not mine, of the scales of justice, because I really wanted to get this exactly right for this work, and just the way the scales would have weight in one side and no weight in the other, because I needed it to look like it's not floating or anything like that, which is obviously a tricky thing with drawing and painting. So as you can see, I'm just sketching in some color detail on the model, playing around with composition, how I wanted to look. I started thinking about maybe the image going into the background, and then realized the perspective wasn't quite right on the figure, and I started playing with adding in those kind of blocks of big color in the background, and now you can also see here that I have started to create the broken up statue. So the composition for this image was the forward statue that is in the foreground of the work. On its left hand side, our right, and flowing into the right hand side of the image, it would be basically being degraded and entrifying, turning into dust, and the dust floating off into the distance. And on the left hand side, there's three other versions of it that are whole, but getting smaller and more distant and further away, and also just a tiny bit faded. Now you can see I'm playing with a little bit more composition. I started bringing in the idea of this moon in the background, because I really wanted to, in this work, alongside the different colors in the background, I wanted to show a passage of time, almost like it's existing in separate realities of time and space from each other. And the way I've done this is by repeating the moon, which I'm going to cut into later to show the passage of time, but also with these color blocks that you saw in the background a minute ago that I've just taken out while I work on this further into the background work of the clouds. And the color blocks is supposed to like represent each a different sort of frame of reality, or it could represent a different season, or really whatever the viewer wants to take from that. But yeah, for me it was about a different plane of existence, and this sort of statue figure sort of branching into like the meta reality, definitely not the metaverse, the sort of, because of what we're talking about in this work is about like a meta-analysis of how we respond to artistic statues, but also colonial ideologies and statues, and that is like a very metaphysical sort of idea. As you can see, I've like really developed the sun and the moon in the background, and now I started the photo bashing process after adding in a bit of blood in the scales. And so this photo bashing process is taking various reference images that I've shot and smudging into them and working into the image to basically draw from their texture and the colors. I've treated each image separately through Lightroom and Photoshop with a different color grading, and so like I'm using the original color from the raw photography that I took, and the texture from that photo, each of those photos, and basically using that to sort of speed paint, but also create like a bulk amount of texture and color without having to like dive back into the color wheel every 2 seconds, and also build like a whole lot of texture and depth in the image up. So I do that by like interposing a whole bunch of different images. So we've got clouds in the background now, the stones, there'll be some cliffs and stuff coming in a moment, and more big boulders, and then I blend those each into each other and make transparent layers, and basically the idea is to create a reality that doesn't exist for my backgrounds, which is a technique that I use in a lot of my work, is to basically composite photos from 10 different areas or more, and bring them in to create something completely new. And so now you can see I'm kind of giving the figures each a bit more shadow and a bit more depth, so that they didn't just feel like they're floating on top of everything, that they're actually sitting on that ground, or standing on that ground, and then they are affecting the reality around them. And you can see I brought the clouds in over the top of the moon, and those colors that were in the background are now floating over the top of everything. So like they're sort of like a haze over everything now, because I've I put a Gaussian blur on them, so they blur into each other, and then boosted up their transparency quite a bit, so they're not just a block color. And now you can see I've brought in the blood motif across the rest of the statues, and I'm just playing with like sort of the final, just doing a little bit of play there with the color of the statue, the main figure, and just playing with like sort of the final elements of the composition and the finishing bits of the work, rendering it, and kind of boosting a few layers and boosting a bit with a bit of color, and dodge and burn on everything. Just to sort of highlight various things and make sure the viewer's eye draws around the image and doesn't just sit and focus on that one point in the middle. So what I was hoping to do is have the viewer's eye start in the middle and then track around the sun, then over the moon, and then back into the middle. So as you sort of are going on a journey, when you're looking at the image, and then you start to like see all of the different layers and different parts of the work. And I'm just kind of doing all this finishing up touches, just experimenting a little bit here, see how this looks, and here we have the final image, which I've added an additional layer over the top of, and put a transparency filter just to make everything pop a bit. It's basically just a little bit of a red filter or an orange filter over everything, just to draw everything out just a tiny bit for me, something I really enjoy doing. And I've also added some grain onto that layer, which is specifically for printing purposes for me. It's not necessarily for the web resolution image, but if it's being printed, adding a bit of grain for me like helps how the image is printed, particularly because I use textured paper, which has a natural grain or natural fiber to the paper as well. But adding the grain digitally or a layer of grain kind of helps play with that. So we have the final image now, and I've talked quite a bit probably around the process, but also around what this conceptually means to me in previous videos. But as you can see, it's the image is a statue holding the scales of justice, one weighed down by blood, and it's fading into the background and being broken down with the passage of time flowing into the right hand side of the image, and in the left hand side of the image that same statue is fading into the background. And so for me, what I was trying to portray with this is like a follow-up to my 2019 Tear It Down image, which is about tearing down the Captain Cook statue in Hyde Park. Well, like, specifically depicts that. Whereas this image was sort of like my follow-up work to that after working with Marie and kind of going through a process of analysis and self-reflection on that work, and kind of looking at how I feel about that work now, and like I guess the indigenous futurism aspects of that work, and my thoughts around iconoclasm and particularly the law, and how there are a disconnect between those things. And what I was sort of pondering with this was like, are we putting too much stock in like colonial monuments? And like technically I think we're not, and they should be torn down. But I think like we, as a battleground for sort of ideologies, they're inherently flawed, because like for one, people, like they are just a artistic representation of a person who lived a few hundred years ago and who represents the colonial movement. However, like to fight over them is inherently flawed, because they only have the meaning that we as people give them. And so this sort of work was talking about how like we can tear them down, yes, absolutely, but also just ignore them as artists, as creators, as humans. If we ignore them and don't give them any credence, they will fade into the existence, into nothingness. And that's why this work is titled Entropy Awakening, because it was sort of an awakening for me around not giving stock to the colonial movement and the colonial machine, and as an artist, to not say anything is to say a lot, and that is often a powerful thing to do. So yeah, this has been the final installment in this short series, Charting Creation. I hope you've enjoyed me talking about how I made this work alongside Marie Hadley. Thanks. Until next time.